afternoon. I am really, truly honored to be able to spend some time with you this afternoon to share some thoughts on the subject of the future of education in Africa. But I was told I was going to be a luncheon speaker. But now I'm speaking after lunch. And I know that there is a big problem that goes with speaking after lunch. Now, those who have been in my classes at the Lagos Business School know that this has a religious connotation. It is that time of the day when good Muslims who pray 5 times a day, wonderful Christians who fast all night, eat all day, suddenly change their religions and begin to worship the Formica in front of them. So I do hope that you stay true to your religion during the course of the next few minutes when I make these remarks. Well, education is really as old as man. The truth is that every society has had to, as it were, build a worldview that enables it set a web of relationships that sustains it and helps it survive. You know, Jared Diamond in his big essay, as I call the book, Collapse, really does make the point that societies invariably tend to fail through failure of culture. And societies prevent themselves or help themselves survive through this transmission of these sets of values, this worldview that they build up. The Germans would say Weltanschauung, which is what really sustains human progress and survival of any group of people. Typically, education in those traditional senses, it's about acculturation. But you know, human progress, the things that enable us, accelerate the essence of our humanity. I am one of those people who I like to think that the essence defined in faith, Genesis 2:15, is that we are essentially created to become co-creators with God, moving creation towards His perfection. And so, being human is about making the world a more wholesome place and fitting better into the gifts of nature, that the quality of our life goes up. This transmission of the capacity to do that is essentially been there with man throughout. But in some societies, some people manage to advance further than their neighbors in the way that they organize themselves. And so, a very important part of how the human race, I think, has functioned is that there's a transmission across cultures. So enculturation becomes a critical part of how we educate people. And the African experience, I think, has engaged with this coming through colonial times. Before colonial intervention, most Africans lived in, whenever I try to kill this thing, it refuses to die, and I can't figure out how these people, this technology, this is one of the problems of civilization. A very safe thing to do is to throw it away. But, yeah, thank you. So, this challenge that man faces, taking knowledge that has been built up in one part of the world to the other came into the process of the evolution of African society as we know it today. Before colonial intervention, African societies were essentially subsistence agricultural societies, where the economy was basically a moral economy. And in a moral economy, the way that you ensure sustenance, because you can't store value differently, is essentially through the relationships that exist. And so you marry somebody from the other village, so if there's a big storm and all your yam seedlings are washed away, your in-laws will take you in and take care of you until you're able to stand. The Moral Economy of the Peasant. It's a lovely book written many years ago by a gentleman called Scott, and opens with a metaphor, Tony's metaphor, that the peasant is so deep in water that even a ripple can drown him. And if that is your condition, then you need to develop ways of surviving. So education in those contexts were about those ways. One interesting thing about that season in our being is that no one was left behind. Colonial intervention brought in the capitalist experience and the capacity to store value in money and all of that. Enabled production to increase in many ways to ensure that people performed or lived effectively in this new time. Education was essentially about taking people out of those contexts. So many of us lived in boarding schools to learn these new ways of doing things. And we made some progress. But I think we didn't make as much progress as we could because of the very narrow goal of colonial experience. And those who were exposed to that education were exposed to it, essentially, to enable them offer functions that ensured basic law and order, basic hygiene, to administer. Minimum government was the requirement, and education was tailored to providing those minimums. But the experience around the world was that education was enormously transforming. Part of my thesis, and Ali Mazrui made big play of this, was that the United States is essentially a function, or American advance, essentially a function of a land-grant university system. And that enabled agriculture to create this new America. Of course, there are other perspectives. One that I also identify very strongly with the perspective offered by Neil Ferguson and others who write about institutions and compared North America with Latin America and why they evolved so differently. And one was so much more economically successful. But I think that even the land-grant university systems were effective in raising the quality of life in the United States because of the stronger institutions in North America. So they are not like different perspectives, but somehow really interrelate in showing how we evolved. And so enculturation was advanced significantly around the world through diaspora experience. If you look at most of the progress of the last half century or further back, you will see a critical role that diaspora have played returning to their original countries. If you look at even Japan and post-Meiji Restoration Japan, as the Tokugawa shogunates essentially expired, you will see the returning of Japanese from Germany, a critical factor in changing how Japan evolved. You look more recently, you will see how the Indian and China experiences have profited from the diaspora. I was in India in 1991 when a remarkable revolution actually started. After India named a prime minister who the joke we used to Kraken who had nothing to lose. The old man appointed Manmohan Singh finance minister. And India went from having less than 3 weeks trading money in its reserves to a dramatic turnaround. And it used to be that if you looked at the flow of investments into India, top was the United States, and the second was a village in Nigeria. And whenever I said that, people in class were, village in Nigeria? Yes, Nri. That place is so poor, how could it possibly? I said, well, okay, they're related, but they're not exactly the same. Nri is non-resident Indians. Second biggest flow of investments into India. So, why did Africa not grow as fast as it could have grown? What role does education have in this discussion? I think a very interesting conversation between two schools in economics, one led by Jeffrey Sachs, who most of you know very well. He was at Harvard and moved to Columbia later, and the other by Paul Collier, who's the chair of the Center for African Economies at Oxford. And Jeff Sachs basically argued that as Europe, knowledge led to advances in Europe, it did not circulate as it should in Africa because of population dispersals and stuff like that. But there are other explanations of why knowledge was not transmitted through Africa based on the philosophy of the colonial experience. And here now comes very important perspective that flows in from this. About 40 or something years ago, there's a Brazilian educator called Paulo Freire. Many of you may remember him. But he wrote a remarkable book, I think it's still the best-selling book in education, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And Paulo Freire writes about colonized peoples and education in the colonial setting. And that the mindset is essentially a piggy bank kind of mindset where you just deposit certain kinds of information necessary to keep them where you want them, literally speaking. His view was a radical Marxist perspective that says that oppressed peoples needed to reject that kind of education, and that education must begin from a certain vision of the world conceived in these ideological frames. He was a great admirer of Frantz Fanon, and he wrote about that. I found Paulo Freire's thinking remarkable. In my graduate school days, I read Freire, but I was not a Marxist. Somebody always asked, when we were in university here, everybody called the other comrade. I was the only one that was not qualified to be called a comrade. Why? Well, I guess my mind was shaped by a group of Dominican Catholic priests from the United States of America. And for me, those ideas meant taking freedom away from people. But I suspect that my mind worked decently enough to take the Freire ideas, and I called it my own thinking on it, the pedagogy of the determined. That you can take that same mindset and have a vision of a world you'd like to see, a world in which you create value, a world in which you build institutions, a world in which you have a web of relationships that support a continuous improvement in the quality of life of the people around you and the duties that you owe to those people. Embedded in that being an essential sense for the dignity of the human person. And I founded a center called the Center for Values in Leadership, essentially to use the ideas of this so-called pedagogy of the determined to shape minds of young people so that we can have a generation of leaders emerge that can envision a different world than they are in now and essentially look for the kinds of knowledge that move the social order towards that which is envisioned. The challenge that we have generally found, I think, with development is that it's about the values that we hold. And I come to example. In the last presentation, Ebele raised the question of young people don't want to read. First of all, I think that the big challenge with education today in Africa, and particularly in Nigeria, is an obsession with tertiary education. And there are several reasons why there's this obsession with tertiary education. It comes partly from the fact that, okay, the most knowledgeable people who challenged an order in which the military came to dominate society were the academics in universities. And the real struggle of the military era was not between politicians and soldiers. It was between the intellectuals and the military. And so for the military, they needed to dominate, humiliate that class. Beginning with what General Gowon and co. did to the University of Lagos professors in 1973, 75, and the battle. The progressive departure from these shores. A few years ago, I wrote a piece, an op-ed piece titled The Generation That Left Town. I was talking about when I got back from grad school in 1982, and a group of us, how we tried to challenge the order. There were about 24 from some of the finest universities around the world. We all were just returned from our PhDs and all of that. We used to meet here at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. 20-something order. And I made the point that when I was writing about 3 or so years ago this piece, only 3 of us still lived in Nigeria. Olisa Bakoba, Femi Aribisala, and myself. Henry Udowe, Mohammed Garba, everybody else now lived in New York, Washington, London, Oxford, wherever it is that they had moved to. The so-called brain drain. Now, to get people to a place of understanding of where we should be going, I think we should start very early. I think the most important level of education is primary education, but we don't pay enough attention to primary education. And I think that the pedagogy of determine begins to get implemented when we shape the minds of young people to see a world that they would like to create even that early. When we were young, we learned to read. We were passionate about books. At age 11, I could tell you how many books I read a month. You know, whether it was Agatha Christie or James Hadley